My struggle to learn English. Introduction: Early life before English. When I was young, life was simple. I grew up in a small town where everyone spoke the same language. Every morning, I would wake up to the sound of my parents talking in the kitchen. They would chat in our native language, laughing and discussing the plans for the day. All my neighbors spoke the same language too. We would greet each other every day with familiar words. I never thought I needed to speak any other language because everyone around me spoke the same one. I could walk to the market, talk to the shopkeepers, or visit friends, and I never had to think twice about what I said. At school, we had different subjects like math, science, and history. One of those subjects was English. But to me, it wasn't important. In our English classes, the teacher would teach us basic words like cat, dog, table, or book. I knew how to say hello and goodbye, but that was about it. We would read short stories in English, but I never really understood them. It felt like a task I had to do, just to pass the class. English didn't feel useful to me. It was like a distant language that didn't matter in my daily life. Everyone I knew spoke our language, so why would I need English? Sometimes, tourists would visit our town. They would come from faraway places and speak in different languages. Among them, many spoke English. I would see them walking in the streets, holding maps, trying to ask for directions. But I could never help them. When they tried to talk to me, I would shake my head because I didn't understand what they were saying. I felt a little embarrassed, but I didn't worry too much about it at the time. There was one thing that always fascinated me in movies. I loved watching movies, especially action films. Most of the good movies were in English. They were exciting and full of adventure. But I had one problem: I couldn't understand the words the actors were saying. I would watch the screen and follow the action, but I couldn't understand the conversations. To help, I would turn on the subtitles. The subtitles were in my language, so I could understand the story, but I always felt like I was missing something. I couldn't enjoy the movie fully because I was too focused on reading the words instead of listening to the actors. As I grew older, I realized that many of the things I loved, music, movies, and books, were in English. I started to see that English wasn't just a subject in school. It was everywhere. People in other countries spoke English, and it was becoming more and more common in my country, too. I heard stories of people getting good jobs because they could speak English. I saw people traveling to other countries, making friends, and exploring new cultures, all because they could speak English. It was like they had a special power that I didn't have. One day, I was with some friends, and we started talking about our dreams for the future. Some of my friends wanted to travel. They talked about going to big cities like New York, London, or Sydney. They said that if we wanted to visit those places, we would need to learn English. English was the language of the world. If we wanted to make friends from other countries or understand the movies and music we loved, we needed to speak English. This was when I realized that English wasn't just another subject in school. It was important for my future. I started to think about my life. I imagined myself traveling to other countries, meeting new people, and having conversations in English. I thought about watching movies without subtitles and listening to English songs, understanding every word. It all sounded exciting, but there was one problem: I didn't know where to start. I had only learned a few words in school, and I didn't feel confident at all. But something inside me told me that I had to try. If I didn't start learning English, I would always feel left behind. So, I made a decision. I decided that I would learn English, no matter how hard it was. This was the beginning of my long journey. First steps in learning. The day I decided to learn English was the first step of my journey, but it was not an easy step. I knew that I couldn't learn English on my own, so I started looking for a way to improve. I heard about an English class that was starting soon at a local language school. They offered lessons for beginners, so I thought it would be the perfect place for me to start. I signed up for the class, feeling both excited and nervous. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew that this was something I had to do. On the first day of class, I walked into the room and saw many other students. Some of them looked as nervous as I was. We all sat down, waiting for the teacher to arrive. I looked around and saw people from different backgrounds. Some were young, some were older, but we all had one thing in common: we didn't know much English. I felt a little better knowing that I wasn't the only one who was starting from the beginning. When the teacher walked into the room, she smiled and greeted us. But there was one problem: she spoke in English right away. I couldn't understand anything she was saying. I looked around and saw that some of the other students looked confused too. I felt lost. My heart started to race, and I thought about leaving the class. How was I going to learn English if I couldn't even understand the teacher? I felt like I was in over my head. But then, something unexpected happened. The teacher slowed down. She began speaking more slowly, using simple words. She wrote things on the board, showing us pictures to help us understand. I still didn't understand everything, but I started to catch a few words here and there. I realized that the teacher wasn't expecting us to understand everything right away. She knew that we were beginners, and she was trying to make it easier for us. As the class went on, I started to feel a little better. The teacher introduced some basic vocabulary, and we practiced saying the words out loud. I made a lot of mistakes, but the teacher didn't mind. She encouraged us to try, even if we didn't get it right. By the end of the class, I felt exhausted. My brain was tired from trying to understand everything, but I was also excited. I had learned a few new words, and I felt like I had taken my first step on a long journey. Support from family and friends. During my journey to learn English, there were many moments when I felt alone. Learning a new language can be a lonely process because it feels like you are the only one facing the difficulties. However, I was lucky to have the support of my family and friends. They didn't speak English, but they helped me in other ways, and their encouragement was important for me to keep going. At first, my family didn't really understand why I wanted to learn English. In our town, most people spoke our native language, and my parents didn't think English was necessary for daily life. My parents grew up speaking only our language, and they had good jobs, so they didn't see why I needed to learn something new. When I told them that I had signed up for English classes, they looked at me with surprise. My mother asked me, "Why do you want to learn English? Isn't it enough to speak our own language?" I explained to her that I wanted to learn English so I could have more opportunities in the future. I told her that speaking English could help me get a better job, meet new people, and travel to different countries. My mother listened carefully, and although she didn't completely understand why English was so important, she supported me. She saw that I was serious about learning, and she wanted to help. My father was more skeptical. He believed that I should focus on the things that were more practical. He said, "Why waste time learning English when there are other things you could do?" I knew that my father wasn't trying to discourage me. He just didn't see the value of learning a language that we didn't use every day. But I stood firm. I told him that I believed learning English would open new doors for me. I was determined to prove to him that it was worth it. Over time, as I continued going to my English classes and working hard, my parents began to notice my efforts. They saw me studying late at night, practicing my pronunciation, and doing my homework. They realized that learning English was something I was serious about, and slowly, they started to support me more actively. One day, my mother came to me and said, "I'm proud of you. I see how hard you are working, and I believe you will succeed." Her words meant a lot to me. Even though she didn't understand English, her encouragement gave me the strength to keep going. My friends were also a big source of support during my journey. I had a close friend named Lynn who already spoke some English. She had studied English for a few years, and she was much better at it than I was. When I told her about my struggles with learning the language, she was very kind and offered to help me. She said, "Don't worry. I went through the same thing when I started learning English. It gets easier with time. I'll help you practice." Lynn and I started meeting a few times a week to practice English together. She would teach me new words, and we would have small conversations in English. At first, I felt shy speaking with her because I made so many mistakes. But Lynn was patient. Whenever I made a mistake, she would correct me gently and explain the right way to say things. I started to feel more comfortable speaking English with her. One of the best things Lynn did was encourage me to speak English out loud as much as possible. She told me that the only way to get better at speaking was to practice, even if I made mistakes. So, we started having little conversations in English every time we met. Sometimes we would go to a cafe, and instead of talking in our native language, we would try to have a full conversation in English. It was hard at first, but Lynn's support made it easier. Another way Lynn helped me was by introducing me to English movies and songs. She knew that I loved movies, and she told me that watching movies in English would help me improve my listening skills. At first, I was worried because I thought I wouldn't understand anything. But Lynn gave me some advice. She said, "Watch the movie with English subtitles. That way, you can listen to the words and read them at the same time. It will help you understand the conversations." I followed her advice, and it worked. Slowly, I started to understand more and more words in the movies. I still needed the subtitles, but I was proud of myself every time I recognized a new word. Lynn also gave me a list of popular English songs to listen to. She said that listening to music in English was a fun way to learn new words and improve my pronunciation. I started listening to English songs every day, and even though I didn't understand all the words, I tried to sing along. Over time, my listening skills improved, and I started to enjoy the learning process more. Another friend who supported me was On, who was also in my English class. On and I were both beginners, and we often studied together. We made a pact to help each other, no matter how hard it got. Sometimes, we would meet after class and practice the new vocabulary we had learned that day. We would quiz each other, take turns asking questions, and try to have short conversations in English. On was just as determined as I was to learn, and having a study partner made the process less lonely. We shared our frustrations, and we celebrated our small victories together. There were times when On and I would both get stuck on a difficult grammar rule or a tricky pronunciation. Instead of getting discouraged, we would laugh and say, "We'll get it next time." Having someone who understood the struggles I was facing made a huge difference. We pushed each other to keep going, and we reminded each other that learning a new language takes time. In addition to my friends and family, I found support in unexpected places. For example, I joined an online English learning group where people from all over the world were practicing their English. We would chat in English, share tips, and encourage each other. It was amazing to see how many people were going through the same journey as me. Some of them were from countries far away, and they were all learning English for different reasons. Some needed English for work, others for travel, and some just for fun. Being part of this group made me feel like I wasn't alone. We were all in this together, and that gave me the motivation to keep improving. Breakthrough moments. After many months of hard work, there came a time when I started to notice small improvements in my English. These were my breakthrough moments, times when I realized that all the practice, mistakes, and effort were starting to pay off. Even though I still had a long way to go, these moments gave me hope and the motivation to keep going. One of my first breakthrough moments happened in my English class. We were having a lesson on basic conversations. The teacher asked us to practice speaking in pairs. I was paired with my classmate, On. The task was simple. We had to introduce ourselves, ask each other questions, and have a short conversation in English. In the past, this type of exercise had always made me nervous. I worried about saying the wrong thing or forgetting a word. But this time was different. When On and I started talking, something surprising happened. I didn't have to think as much about every word I was saying. The words came more naturally. I was able to ask On questions like, "What did you do last weekend?" and "How do you like the class so far?" without struggling to find the right words. On answered me in English, and I understood what she was saying. We went back and forth, having a simple conversation, and I realized that I was speaking English more fluently than before. It wasn't perfect, but it felt easier. For the first time, I felt confident speaking in class. After the exercise, the teacher gave us feedback. She said that we were improving and that we should be proud of ourselves. I smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. This was one of the first times that I felt like I was really getting better at speaking English. It was a small conversation, but for me, it was a big step forward. Another breakthrough moment came when I was watching a movie in English. As I mentioned earlier, I loved watching movies, but I always had to rely on subtitles in my language. One day, I decided to challenge myself. I chose a movie that I had already seen before, but this time, I watched it with English subtitles instead of subtitles in my language. At first, it was hard. I had to concentrate a lot because I wasn't used to reading English subtitles. But as the movie went on, something amazing happened. I started to understand more of the dialogue. There were still many words that I didn't know, but I could follow the story without feeling completely lost. I recognized some of the words and phrases that I had learned in class, and I was able to connect them to what was happening in the movie. By the end of the movie, I felt proud of myself. I had watched an English movie with English subtitles, and I understood most of it. It was a breakthrough because I realized that I didn't need to rely on my native language as much anymore. My English was improving, and I could enjoy movies in a new way. Listening to English music was another area where I experienced a breakthrough. Before, I would listen to English songs, but I didn't understand the lyrics. The music was enjoyable, but the words felt like a mystery. One day, I was listening to a song that Lynn had recommended. It was a slow song, with clear lyrics, and I had heard it many times before. This time, as I listened, I started to understand some of the words. The singer was talking about love, and I recognized phrases like "I miss you" and "I'll never let you go." I had learned these phrases in class, but hearing them in a song made them feel more real. I played the song again and again, each time picking up more words. It felt like a puzzle that I was slowly solving. For the first time, I understood not just the music, but also the message of the song. It was an amazing feeling. I realized that learning English wasn't just about studying from books. It was about being able to enjoy things like music, movies, and conversations in a whole new way. Another major breakthrough came when I started to feel more confident in speaking English outside of class. One day, I was at a cafe with Lynn. We were sitting outside, enjoying our drinks, when a tourist walked up to us. He looked lost and asked, "Excuse me, can you help me find the bus station?" Normally, in this situation, I would have felt nervous and unsure about how to respond. But this time, I felt ready. I smiled and said, "Yes, it's just down the street. Walk straight for about 5 minutes, and you'll see it on the right." The tourist thanked me and walked away. I couldn't believe it. I had just helped someone in English. I turned to Lynn, and she smiled at me. "You did great," she said. "Your English is improving a lot." It was a small moment, but it meant a lot to me. For the first time, I felt confident using English in real life. I wasn't just practicing in class anymore, I was actually using the language to communicate with other people. Another big breakthrough was when I had my first dream in English. It sounds funny, but this was a moment that really showed me how much I was improving. In the dream, I was talking to someone in English. We were having a conversation, and I understood everything they were saying. I woke up feeling surprised and excited. It was as if my brain was starting to think in English, even when I was asleep. This was a sign that I was making real progress. These breakthrough moments didn't happen all at once. They came slowly, over time, after a lot of practice and hard work. But each time I experienced one, it gave me more confidence. It reminded me that I was on the right path and that I was capable of learning English. These small successes kept me motivated, even when things got difficult. Learning English through everyday life. As time went on, I realized that one of the best ways to improve my English was to practice it in my everyday life. At first, I thought I could only learn English in class, by doing homework or studying grammar books. But soon I discovered that English was everywhere around me, even in small, everyday activities. The more I practiced, the more confident I became in using English in real-life situations. One of the first things I started doing was reading signs and labels in English. In my city, many public places like restaurants, shopping malls, and bus stations had signs in both my language and English. Before, I would only read the signs in my language, but now, I made it a habit to read the English version as well. For example, when I went to the supermarket, I noticed that all the products had labels in English. Instead of just grabbing what I needed, I took the time to read the labels in English and learn new words. I learned simple words like milk, bread, and vegetables, but also more difficult words like nutritional information and ingredients. This small change helped me expand my vocabulary little by little. I also started practicing my English at restaurants and cafes. In some of the bigger restaurants, the menu was written in both languages. So, instead of looking at the menu in my language, I began to read it in English. I would go through the items and try to understand what each dish was. Sometimes, if I didn't know a word, I would ask the waiter, "What does this mean?" They were usually happy to explain, and I learned new food-related words like appetizer, main course, and dessert. One day, I decided to challenge myself. I went to a cafe where I knew the staff could speak English, and I ordered my coffee in English. I said, "I'd like a cup of coffee with milk, please." The barista smiled and responded in English, asking me if I wanted anything else. For the first time, I had a full conversation in English while ordering something. It was a small step, but it made me feel more comfortable using English in my everyday life. Another way I practiced English was by using technology and social media. I changed the language settings on my phone to English. At first, this made things a little harder because I wasn't used to seeing everything in English. But soon, I started to recognize common words like settings, messages, and notifications. This simple change helped me see and use English every day without even thinking about it. I also started following English-speaking accounts on social media. I followed pages that posted about things I liked, such as travel, cooking, and photography. As I scrolled through my feed, I read posts and comments in English, which helped me improve my reading skills. Watching YouTube videos in English also became a big part of my learning process. At first, I only watched videos with subtitles in my language, but then I switched to English subtitles. Eventually, I challenged myself to watch some videos without any subtitles at all. I started with short videos, like cooking tutorials or travel vlogs, where the language was simple, and the speakers spoke slowly. I didn't always understand every word, but I could follow along with the main ideas. Over time, my listening skills got better, and I could watch longer videos without feeling lost. Another thing I did was write a journal in English. Every night before bed, I would write a few sentences about my day in English. I didn't worry about making perfect sentences or using difficult words. The goal was just to practice expressing my thoughts in English. Some days, I wrote simple things like "Today I went to the park," or "I had lunch with my friend." Other days, I wrote about my struggles with learning English, like "I found it hard to understand the video I watched today." Writing regularly helped me practice my grammar and vocabulary in a relaxed way. One of the biggest ways I practiced English was by speaking with foreigners and tourists. In my city, there were often tourists who spoke English, and I started to look for opportunities to talk to them. For example, if I saw someone looking at a map, I would approach them and ask, "Do you need help?" Most of the time, they were happy to talk to me, and I would give them directions or recommend places to visit. At first, I was nervous about starting conversations, but the more I practiced, the more comfortable I became. One memorable moment was when I met a couple from the United States. They were trying to find a famous landmark in the city, and I helped them by giving directions in English. We ended up talking for about 10 minutes, and they told me about their travels. I was surprised by how much I understood and how well I could communicate. This experience showed me that I could use English in real-life situations, not just in the classroom. I also learned English by doing simple things like shopping online. Many online stores had their websites in English, and I would browse through the products, reading descriptions and reviews. This helped me learn new words related to clothes, electronics, and everyday items. It also gave me practice with understanding prices, sizes, and customer reviews in English. One of the most fun ways I practiced English was by playing video games. Some of my favorite games were available in English, and I would read the instructions, storylines, and dialogue between characters. This helped me learn new words in a fun and interactive way. I also played online games where I could chat with players from other countries. Sometimes, we would work together in the game, and I had to communicate with them in English. It wasn't always easy, but it was a great way to practice English in a casual setting. Over time, I realized that learning English didn't have to be limited to the classroom. By using English in everyday life, I was able to practice and improve without even noticing. Whether I was reading a sign, ordering coffee, or watching a video, I was learning new words and becoming more confident in my English skills. The more I used English in my daily life, the more natural it became, and slowly, I started to feel like English was a part of me. Challenges I faced. Even though I made progress in learning English, there were still many challenges along the way. Learning a new language is never easy, and I often felt frustrated and discouraged. Some days, I felt like I wasn't improving at all, and other days, I felt overwhelmed by the amount of things I still needed to learn. However, facing these challenges helped me grow stronger and more determined. One of the biggest challenges I faced was grammar. English grammar is full of rules, and some of them didn't make sense to me at first. For example, I struggled with using the correct tenses. In my language, we don't have as many tenses, so trying to understand when to use the past tense, present perfect, or future tense in English was confusing. I often mixed them up in my sentences, and my teacher had to correct me many times. For example, I would say, "Yesterday, I go to the store," instead of "Yesterday, I went to the store." It seemed like every time I learned one grammar rule, there was another one waiting for me to figure out. Another challenge was pronunciation. English pronunciation is tricky because many words don't sound the way they are spelled. For example, the word through has a silent GH, and the word island has a silent LES. It was hard for me to remember which letters were silent and how to say words correctly. Sometimes, I would say a word, and people wouldn't understand me because my pronunciation was wrong. I remember one time I tried to say the word comfortable, but it came out sounding very different from how native speakers say it. I felt embarrassed, but I kept practicing. Listening to native speakers was also difficult for me. In class, our teacher spoke slowly and clearly, so I could understand most of what she was saying. But when I listened to native speakers in real life or in movies, they spoke much faster. Sometimes they used slang or expressions that I didn't know. I remember trying to watch an English movie without subtitles for the first time. I only understood a few words here and there, and by the end of the movie, I felt frustrated. It seemed like native speakers were speaking too fast, and I couldn't keep up. It made me doubt my progress, and I wondered if I would ever be able to understand English fluently. Another challenge was vocabulary. There are so many words in English, and it felt like I needed to learn 1,000 new words every day just to keep up. Some words had similar meanings, and I didn't know when to use which one. For example, words like big, large, and huge all mean something similar, but they are used in different situations. This made me feel confused, and I often had to ask my teacher or friends for help. I also struggled with remembering new words after I learned them. I would learn a word in class, but then I would forget it when I tried to use it in a conversation. Speaking English in public was another challenge. Even though I practiced speaking in class, it was much harder to speak English in real-life situations. I was afraid of making mistakes or sounding silly. Sometimes, when I spoke to someone in English, I would get nervous and forget the words I wanted to say. This made me feel embarrassed, and there were times when I wanted to give up. I felt like no matter how much I studied, I would never be able to speak English like a native speaker. One of the hardest moments for me was when I had to give a presentation in English for my class. Our teacher asked us to prepare a short presentation about a topic of our choice. I decided to talk about my favorite hobby, cooking. I spent hours preparing my presentation, writing down what I wanted to say, and practicing in front of the mirror. But when the day of the presentation came, I felt so nervous. As I stood in front of the class, I could feel my hands shaking, and I forgot some of the words I had prepared. I stumbled over my sentences, and I felt like everyone was watching me make mistakes. Even though my classmates were supportive, I felt embarrassed, and I doubted my ability to speak English confidently. Another big challenge was staying motivated. Learning a new language takes a lot of time and effort, and sometimes I felt like I wasn't making any progress. There were days when I didn't want to study or go to class because I felt tired and frustrated. I remember one week when I made several mistakes during class, and it made me feel like I would never get better. It was easy to get discouraged, especially when I compared myself to others who seemed to learn faster than me. One more challenge was thinking in English. Even though I was learning English, my mind was still thinking in my native language. Every time I wanted to speak or write in English, I had to translate the words in my head first. This made me slower, and sometimes my sentences didn't come out correctly because I was translating word for word. For example, in my language, we might say, "I have hunger" to mean, "I am hungry," but in English, it sounds strange if you translate it directly. It took me a long time to learn how to stop translating and start thinking in English naturally. Despite all these challenges, I didn't give up. Every time I faced a difficult situation, I reminded myself of my goals and why I wanted to learn English in the first place. I knew that if I kept practicing, I would eventually overcome these obstacles. The key was to keep going, even when things got tough. Overcoming my fears. As I continued learning English, I realized that one of the biggest barriers I faced was fear. I was afraid of making mistakes, afraid of sounding silly, and afraid that people would not understand me. This fear held me back in many situations, and it was something I had to overcome if I wanted to improve. I knew that if I didn't face my fears, I would never be able to use English confidently. One of my biggest fears was speaking in front of other people. Even though I practiced speaking in class, I always felt nervous when I had to speak English in public. I was afraid that I would forget the words or use the wrong grammar. This fear stopped me from participating in conversations, and sometimes I would stay quiet even when I wanted to say something. I remember one time when I was at a gathering with some friends, and a foreigner joined our group. Everyone was talking, and I wanted to join the conversation, but I was too scared. I kept thinking, what if I say something wrong? What if they don't understand me? So, I stayed silent, and later, I felt disappointed in myself. I knew that if I wanted to get better at speaking English, I had to overcome this fear. So, I made a decision to push myself out of my comfort zone. The next time I was in a similar situation, I promised myself that I would try to speak, even if I made mistakes. The opportunity came one day when I was at a cafe with Lynn. We were sitting next to a group of tourists who were speaking in English. I felt nervous, but I reminded myself of my promise. I turned to one of the tourists and asked, "Where are you from?" They smiled and answered, "We're from Australia." I was a little nervous, but I continued the conversation. It wasn't perfect, but I managed to ask them a few questions and talk about their trip. After the conversation, I felt proud of myself. I had faced my fear and spoken English with strangers. Another fear I had to overcome was the fear of making mistakes. In the beginning, I wanted to speak perfect English. I didn't want to say the wrong word or use the wrong grammar. But the truth is, everyone makes mistakes when learning a new language, and it's a natural part of the process. I had to learn that it's okay to make mistakes, and that's how we learn. My teacher always told us, don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's better to try and make a mistake than to say nothing at all. One day, I was talking to a classmate after school. We were speaking in English, and I accidentally used the wrong tense. I said, "Yesterday, I am going to the park," instead of "yesterday, I went to the park." My classmate corrected me, but instead of feeling embarrassed, I realized that this was a learning opportunity. I thanked my classmate for correcting me, and I made a note of the mistake so that I wouldn't repeat it. This experience taught me that making mistakes wasn't something to be afraid of. It was actually a way to get better. I also had to overcome my fear of listening to native speakers. In the beginning, listening to native speakers was difficult because they spoke so fast, and they used words and phrases that I didn't understand. This made me feel nervous and frustrated. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to follow the conversation, and I worried that I would miss important information. But instead of avoiding these situations, I decided to face them. I started watching more videos in English, even if I didn't understand every word. I listened carefully and tried to pick up on the main ideas. Over time, my listening skills improved, and I became less afraid of speaking with native speakers. I learned that it was okay to ask someone to repeat themselves if I didn't understand. One of the hardest fears to overcome was the fear of not being good enough. Sometimes, I compared myself to other students in my class, and I felt like they were learning faster than me. I would hear someone speak English fluently, and I would think, I'll never be able to speak like that. This fear made me doubt my abilities, and there were times when I wanted to give up. But then I realized that everyone learns at their own pace, and it's not fair to compare myself to others. I reminded myself of how far I had come, and I focused on my own progress. I celebrated the small victories, like having a conversation without translating in my head, or understanding a new word in a movie. These small steps gave me the confidence to keep going. Another important step in overcoming my fears was practicing self-confidence. I realized that a lot of my fear came from not believing in myself. I was too worried about what other people thought of me. I thought they would laugh at my mistakes or think I wasn't good enough. But the more I practiced English, the more I realized that people were usually kind and understanding. They didn't mind if I made a mistake or asked for help. They were happy that I was trying to learn their language. This gave me the courage to keep practicing, even when it was hard. One of the moments that helped me overcome my fears was when I had to give a speech in English for a school event. I was so nervous leading up to the day of the speech. I practiced over and over, but I was still afraid that I would forget my words or make a mistake in front of everyone. On the day of the event, I stood up in front of the audience with my heart racing. I took a deep breath and started speaking. At first, I was nervous, but as I kept going, I realized that I knew what I was saying. Even though I made a few mistakes, I kept going, and by the end of the speech, I felt proud of myself. It wasn't perfect, but I had faced my fear and succeeded. In the end, overcoming my fears was one of the most important parts of my English learning journey. I learned that fear is natural, but it doesn't have to stop me. By pushing myself to speak, listen, and make mistakes, I became more confident in my abilities. I realized that the only way to improve was to keep trying, even when I was afraid. Every time I faced my fear, I grew stronger and more capable. This was one of the greatest lessons I learned, not just in learning English, but in life. Reaching milestones. As time went on, I started to notice small changes in my English abilities. These small changes were milestones that showed me I was making progress, even when it didn't feel like it. Each milestone gave me confidence and motivation to keep going. Learning English is a long journey, but every step forward, no matter how small, is important. One of the first milestones I reached was when I could understand conversations without needing to translate everything in my head. In the beginning, I always had to translate from English to my native language, and then think of a response in my language before translating it back to English. This made conversation slow and difficult. But after practicing for some time, I noticed that I was starting to understand sentences directly in English. I didn't need to translate word for word anymore. For example, when I listened to my teacher in class or watched English videos, I could follow along without having to think in my native language. This was a big step for me, and it made me feel more comfortable using English in real-life situations. Another milestone was when I had my first full conversation in English with a native speaker. It happened one day when I was traveling with my family. We met a tourist who was visiting our country, and they asked me for directions in English. At first, I felt nervous, but I remembered all the practice I had done. I gave them directions and even asked them a few questions about their trip. We talked for a few minutes, and I was surprised at how well I understood them and how easily I could respond. This conversation gave me a lot of confidence because it showed me that all my hard work was paying off. I realized that I could use English in real situations, not just in the classroom. A big milestone for me was when I started to enjoy reading books in English. When I first started learning English, reading was difficult because I didn't know many words. I often had to stop and look up words in the dictionary, which made reading slow and frustrating. But as my vocabulary grew, reading became easier and more enjoyable. I started with short books, like children's stories, and as I improved, I moved on to longer books. I remember the first time I finished reading a full book in English without needing to use a dictionary. It was a simple book, but I felt proud of myself for understanding the story and finishing it. Reading in English became a way for me to practice my language skills while also enjoying the process. Another important milestone was when I could write a full essay in English. Writing in English was one of the hardest parts of learning the language for me. I often struggled with grammar, sentence structure, and finding the right words to express my thoughts. But after practicing through writing short paragraphs and journals, I slowly improved. I remember when my teacher asked us to write a longer essay about a topic of our choice. I chose to write about my favorite hobby, cooking. At first, I wasn't sure if I could do it, but I took my time and wrote the essay step by step. When I finished, I felt a sense of accomplishment. I knew it wasn't perfect, but it was much better than my earlier writing. This milestone showed me that I was making progress, and it motivated me to keep practicing my writing skills. Listening to English music and understanding the lyrics was another milestone that made me feel proud. In the beginning, when I listened to English songs, I couldn't understand most of the words. The music was fast, and the singers used slang or expressions I didn't know. But after practicing my listening skills and learning more vocabulary, I noticed that I could understand parts of the songs. One day, I was listening to one of my favorite English songs, and I realized that I could understand almost all the lyrics. This made me feel excited because it was a fun way to practice English, and it showed me that I was improving. A major milestone for me was when I was able to travel abroad and use English in different situations. My family and I went on a vacation to an English-speaking country, and I was nervous at first. I knew I would have to speak English to order food, ask for directions, and communicate with people. But as soon as we arrived, I realized that I was ready. I was able to order at restaurants, ask questions at the hotel, and even have short conversations with locals. This experience showed me that I had reached a level of English where I could use it confidently in real-life situations, and it made me feel proud of how far I had come. Another milestone was when I could watch English movies and understand the story without needing subtitles. In the past, I always watched English movies with subtitles in my language because I couldn't understand everything the characters were saying. But after practicing my listening skills for a long time, I tried watching a movie without subtitles. At first, I was worried that I wouldn't understand, but as the movie went on, I realized that I could follow the story. I didn't understand every single word, but I knew what was happening in the movie, and that was enough. This milestone made me feel like I was finally getting closer to fluency. Lastly, one of the most important milestones was when I became comfortable speaking English in front of a group of people. In the beginning, I was very shy when speaking English, especially in front of others. I was afraid of making mistakes or being judged. But after many presentations in class and speaking with native speakers, I gained more confidence. I remember the first time I spoke in front of a group without feeling too nervous. It was a class presentation, and instead of being scared, I focused on what I wanted to say. When I finished, I felt a sense of accomplishment. This milestone was important because it showed me that I had grown not only in my language skills, but also in my confidence. These milestones were proof that I was making progress. Each one gave me a sense of pride and pushed me to keep going. Learning English is a journey, and it's important to celebrate every achievement along the way, no matter how small. Learning English has changed my life in so many ways, and I am grateful for the journey. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Now, I can say that I am proud of my progress and excited for the future. I hope that my story can inspire others who are learning English to keep going and never give up. If there is one piece of advice I would give to anyone learning English, it would be this: don't be afraid to make mistakes, and keep practicing every day. Progress may feel slow at times, but every step you take brings you closer to your goal. Stay patient, stay consistent, and remember that you are capable of achieving great things.